Welcome in, everyone. Welcome to the Buddhist Wisdom Podcast. As you can tell, my guest is once again Scott Snibbe from The Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment. He's here for our part two, talking about the Dharma, healthy skepticism, practicing the path as a modern practitioner in the Western world. So yeah, welcome, Scott. Thanks for joining me again for part two.
Yeah, nice to see you again, Scott.
Yeah, it's always good to see you. So yeah, I just thought we can kind of like pick up where we left off. And where did we leave off? That's what I think I was trying to remember.
2 weeks ago or something.
Yeah, something like that. But yeah, I remember we were starting to get into the discussion of a skepticism or healthy skepticism, what the practice of healthy skepticism is, how it relates to the Buddhist path. So I thought we can kind of, meander and share there a little bit more, if that sounds good to you.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah. I mean, first off, how are you? How's it going? Like, what's going on in your life?
Oh,
okay?
I'm doing great. I'm just finishing a draft of the book. There's a Skeptic's Path book that's going to come out at the end of the year. So I'm doing one last pass and sending off to my editor next week. And we just released this class too, the Skeptic's Path, the first class. So it's exciting to finally start our educational programs. That was the main goal of Skeptic's Path, is to have an educational program and teach people to meditate in addition to the podcast. So I'm really excited about that.
Me too. That's awesome. Yeah. So anyone out there, please check that out. Course just launched, and the book will be out in the fall. That's correct?
Yeah, the book will be out right now. It's scheduled for December, and the course is launching, and it starts on March 5th. And it's synchronous, so there's one topic. It's 12 weeks, and there's one topic every week. We talk about different topics of analytical meditation.
Cool. There's not a lot of courses on analytical meditation out there, I'm guessing. I'm sure there's various guided meditations and kind of like traditional Buddhist teachings at like a Buddhist center, but not a lot on I don't know. Is that true? Have you seen any courses on analytical?
No. And we've become, our site is actually one of the main places people go to find out about analytical meditation now. That was part of the whole reason I started at Skeptic's Path, was because the type of meditation you and I learned in our tradition, this Tibetan Nalanda tradition,
Sure.
Indo-Tibetan tradition, it emphasizes so much analytical meditation, which is a meditation of where you actually quite engage your mind with thoughts and critical thinking, emotions, stories, and so there weren't very many sources for that weren't religious. There are good ones, obviously, in our tradition. There's lots of religious books on the Lam Rim and other types of analytical meditation. But yeah, there's almost a complete void of even that word, analytical meditation. And in scientific studies, too, I was actually trying to track down references for the book. And I talked to a few scientists, and they said, now there's basically a void in the scientific literature about analytical meditation, although specific types of analytical meditation like compassion or loving kindness meditation have been studied. But the actual word analytical meditation and the broader type of meditation hasn't been studied. So any scientists listening out there, it's a big opportunity to study the effects of it.
Yeah. And I mean, there's all these kind of studies being done on how meditation affects the brain. But I would imagine they're not studying analytical because they're trying to study like parts of the brain when we're in other states besides thinking. Maybe that's why they're not studying it that much.
Yeah, well, mindfulness was number one. Obviously, that one's been studied a lot, and there are concrete benefits, in most studies. Although there are a few places where mindfulness meditation can be harmful. That they have shown with science. And then compassion is kind of like number two, I think, in terms of studying loving kindness sometimes and variations.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'm excited. Yeah, and I mean, just describing a little bit. Maybe we could start there, because I think when I think of, healthy skepticism in relation to a spiritual path is, I think, a big topic. So, I'm sure we're going to get into it in its different facets together. But maybe we can just start there with analytical meditation. Because for me, I don't know about you, but analytical meditation over the years, and maybe we can describe more what analytical meditation is. Like, we can kind of let the audience know, because maybe some of the listeners haven't done that much, or for them that's like foreign that you can think while you meditate. But I know for me, it's really helped to form a healthy relationship to skepticism, because we actually are questioning within analytical meditation.
Yeah, sometimes I tell people who don't know about it that analytical meditation is like a story. That it's a story that you tell yourself in meditation. Someone could be telling you too if they're guiding it, if you're listening to a guided meditation. But it's a story that evokes certain emotions. It evokes positive, transformational thoughts that bring out your best qualities. So it's quite precise. I think the definition of meditation, from a Buddhist perspective, isn't just sitting on a cushion or something like that. It's actually focusing on virtue. It's focusing on thoughts that would bring about good in your mind and good in the world. So the stabilizing form of meditation, which is sometimes called mindfulness meditation also, is it could be virtuous. It kind of depends what's in the background. Like you can go in. I often talk about like Darth Vader, is meditating in The Empire Strikes Back. Almost whenever he's not killing people, he's meditating. So he's kind of the cartoon example that you can meditate for evil or something like that. Like you can meditate just to strengthen your concentration, to work harder, or even to harm people. So when you combine, but you have to combine the two. You have the power of concentration, because if you can't concentrate on something, then you won't do anything. You can't concentrate on work or a conversation or meditation. But then analytical meditation is the thing that can really steer your mind in some direction, like towards understanding impermanence, how precious our life is, compassion, love, patience, generosity, the interdependent nature of reality. So there's all these specific topics. And something I really noticed when I first got asked to lead meditation, I asked my teachers what to do. And they said, always combine some analytical meditation, some stabilizing meditation, also some aspirational meditation. Like in our tradition, what we call guru devotion, guru yoga, which doesn't sound like it would be for beginners or non-religious people, but to put that into non-religious terms, like aspiration, just an aspiration of who's worth admiring in life, what kind of people are worth admiring in life, what qualities are worth admiring, and to see an arrow that I can get there. All the scientific evidence and also the Buddhist tradition, what we've seen from meditators shows that you can almost limitlessly strengthen your good qualities, and that the disturbing ones just fall by the wayside. You don't even have to actively fight them necessarily, but because the virtuous types of thoughts like love, compassion, patience, non-harming, and so on, that they're actually natural. They're more intrinsic. This is the good news from Buddhism, right? Is that it sees your intrinsic nature as good, and if you dive under that in subtle forms of meditation, like meditating on the mind, it's almost like swimming in a swimming pool of light or something. Like all of a sudden you see, wow, this is what's underneath all the other stuff in my mind, and then you resurface, and those the disturbing types of thoughts and emotions are, as are said to be adventitious, is the word they often use. It's a kind of a weird, obscure name, but fleeting maybe is a better word. That are disturbing emotions, even though they can overwhelm us, aren't as deep as the good ones. So there's a lot to say about analytical meditation, but in general, it uses story, thought, and emotion to transform your mind. The other thing is, I've found that I'm actually curious because you've led so much meditations, but I've found people can focus on analytical meditations much better because it's a changing object. It's more like listening to a podcast or even watching a TV show or something like that. And no one's ever got up and walked out of a 1 hour meditation session. I've done, many thousands of people. And that's why I always tell people, it's like, no one's ever stood up and walked out before the hour was up. But almost everybody has stood up and walked out on their own meditation session. It gets pretty hard even after 5 minutes sometimes. So I think analytical meditation is, paradoxically, it can actually train your concentration. Maybe faster and better for a lot of people, because we're used to thinking. So if we can just engage those thoughts in a way that's constructive.
I think I've noticed a lot of people if I'm working with someone who's more newer to Buddhist practice or meditation, often when I jump right into like awareness practices, those are quite difficult because awareness is something, that's a quality of our mind that's not thinking, but it's a natural quality of the mind that we can be watchful. But it's not something we cultivate unless we meditate. And just in the beginning, we're not going to have much of a relationship to that right away because we have to recognize it and then kind of reinforce that recognition through practice. So yeah, I've noticed actually a lot of people like loving, forms of I would say the most popular form of loving kindness meditation, which is through phrases or, repeating, may I be happy, may you be happy, those kinds of things, because it's a type of analytical meditation. Very bare bones one, but it's something to grab onto. Like you said, it's a story to follow. It's a process to follow that is thought based, which we're also used to,
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I was thinking while you were talking too, I wasn't doing analytical meditation, but I was thinking, about, this sense of, I have gotten this question about, we could start our journey talking about healthy skepticism in relation to our paths, is where I'd love to focus. We could start it here if you want, which is, I've actually had some students over the years who, when I'm introducing a lot of analytical meditation, like let's say from the Lam Rim or other forms of it, and in the Nyingma and Kagyu lineages of Tibetan Buddhism, they often practice the Lam Rim in the form of the four thoughts that turn the mind, and then they add bodhicitta, and then they add studies of Madhyamaka. So it ends up being more or less the same thing. But within that, I've had some people struggle because they reach this point where they're like, wait, am I just brainwashing myself with other ideas? And so maybe I'd love to hear your thoughts on that because we can start there.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes, you are brainwashing yourself. But the longer answer is you are always brainwashing yourself. And this is what we know from neuroscience. There's a phrase that one of the pioneers of neuroscience, neuroplasticity said, neurons that fire together wire together. So this is the scientific backing for what happens with meditation or any kind of thought and action, is that anything you do, it reinforces the habit of doing it again and again. Anything you think, it reinforces the habit of thinking it again and again. And this is where science and Buddhism completely align, that it's a scientific mechanism for why meditation works. So we're always brainwashing ourselves. When you're telling yourself a story about like how much you don't like your boss, or how much you want to eat a piece of cake or something like that, you're brainwashing yourself. You're telling yourself a story. So analytical meditation is taking control of that process and learning techniques. It's like with muscle training or exercise, where you might naively get a little bit of exercise by walking down the street, and then you could learn to run or something like that. But then if you really learn how to isolate every muscle group, for example, in your workout, then all of a sudden you have much more control over your body, and you can work on the upper body and the lower body and your hands and fingers and toes and all of that. So I think that's what analytical meditation is. It's acknowledging we're always brainwashing ourselves, and then using a toolkit of meditations that were developed over at least 1,000 years, 1,500 years, maybe some of them since the Buddhist time, but the ones in our lineage 1,000, 1,500 years. They've worked for a lot of different people. So yeah, you are brainwashing yourself, but you're always brainwashing yourself. So you might as well take control of that process. And not only yourself, by everything you do, watching a movie. Sometimes I tell people, if you're willing to go watch, a Marvel movie or some movie where 100 people get killed in 90 minutes, you might as well try some of these other ways of condition. All of those things condition your mind. Watching people get killed, watching people argue with each other. These things all condition ourselves. One way or another.
Yeah. No, well said. And I usually, express that same notion of like, we're always brainwashing ourselves by the sense of, we all believe in something, There's always belief functioning. And I think that this is kind of brings up something, to me that's quite important, because when we're establishing what we call in some of the Buddhist traditions, like Tibetan Buddhism, when we're establishing view meaning like perspective, what we're trying to get used to, what we're trying to bring into our mind and life, right? When we're studying the Buddhist view, for me, the first thing that needs to be established is that we already have a view. We already have a belief, or as you put it, there's already some sense of being brainwashed into some perspective, or lots of perspectives about ourselves in the world. So it's an interesting one, because I don't know how you feel about that personally. I don't feel like that was explicit to me in my Buddhist education in Tibetan Buddhism initially, and it's just something I had to. I don't know if it's like completely on my own. I also had other teachers who then eventually filled that in for me.
Yeah, it's not part of normal Tibetan Buddhism, because the whole tradition, everyone was a Buddhist. So historically, they just knew that was the common view for everybody. I think I was lucky with my teachers, because I think very early on, teachers like Venerable Lene, for example, I remember him very clearly saying, everyone has their ism. There's actually 7 billion of them on this planet. You have the Tusa-ism and Snibbe-ism and everything else. So I did have a teacher say that really on, analyze, go sit for a little while or take a walk and think, what do I believe? Like, for example, why do things happen in the world? Do I think that things are random? Do I think there's some reward or punishment for virtue and harm? Do I think it's completely mechanistic and deterministic, that it all started with the Big Bang, and the universe operates like a clock or a machine? So and then to put your mind in certain situations, like if I was like on a plane and it started diving, like, would I start praying? what thoughts could go through my head? Where did I come from? Like, what happened? What was my mind before I was born? What was it? Where will it go after it dies? Have I known people that died, and what did that feel like? I think probing those boundaries of existence yourself, it's a great thing to start with, before you even get into looking at the Buddhist view, just to figure out what you really believe, because somehow that's because a lot of people weren't raised with any religion, and a lot of parents say, "Oh, we'll let our kid choose." But really, that means raising your kid without religion, and then they have to kind of discover it for themselves as they get older. So yeah, we all have some belief, and I think when you really look at it, a lot of our beliefs are the sort of advertising corporate beliefs that if we get the right stuff, that we'll be happy. That will, if we have sufficient, and it doesn't have to be fancy things like a Tesla, but just if you have a nice house and good food and friends and a family, like, that's reasonable. Actually, it's reasonable to have those things. But the messages we see through advertising and even through movies is kind of like, you're not complete yourself, that you need things outside yourself to make you happy. And that's a little different than the Buddhist view, which is that you can find a deep happiness just from within yourself. And it doesn't mean you just go hide out and hide in a cave for the rest of your life. It actually make you a better husband and partner and friend and president and totally. Boss and nurse and everything else. It'll actually improve all your relationships if you don't approach them with such a sense of like neediness and want that you require such a big list of things for your happiness.
Yeah, totally. And this is kind of I think on a personal level, I'll just kind of describe my own experience. This is a very challenging area. It has been a very challenging area for me, because when we turn the lens to look at the Buddhist view to see, hey, is this describing reality correctly? Is this something useful? Like you said, initially we're just trying to connect with virtuous states of mind, or states of mind that are more pro-social, like compassion, loving kindness, etc., awareness. But eventually, we have to turn the lens back around to discover, where are my limitations in relation to that? What beliefs am I holding that are preventing me from actually like being compassion, for instance, or being awareness? And for me, that's been quite quite challenging. I mean, that's been a path. That's been a, multi-year process. So I'd love to hear, your experience with that, but also, I wanted to say, I'd love to get into this conversation after that so what's the use for secularism? Because if we're already, sorry, I'm maybe asking too many questions in the same, breath, but, I have this doubt of like why we need to even use the word secularism, because secularism often represents a view that's pushing away other views, but holding its own view and not recognizing that or denying that there's a view a little bit. You said, like someone who's maybe raised without religion or spirituality, they're raised in something, and why is that different than a form of spirituality? I mean, these are questions I'm asking,
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe it's always nice to start out with the Dalai Lama, because His Holiness. You see, when we say a word, this is a thing that Buddhism acknowledges very well, is that when we say a word, each of us actually hears it differently and interprets. So even if you say this word secular, even you and I have different perspectives on it. So the way His Holiness the Dalai Lama uses the word secular, I think, in a very beautiful way, because he talks about Indian society as being a model secular society, because it's so tolerant of every type of religion, as well as no religion. And I think that's a very nice idea of secularism, is more like inclusive. It doesn't exclude religion, secularity, but it's actually a plurality of accepting a plurality of beliefs. So that's how His Holiness kind of uses that term, which is quite nice. If I'm not mistaking him, this is just from listening to some of his talks.
Yeah, but that's great. I mean, to me, I resonate a lot with that. Yeah. Having spent time in India and really resonate with that cultural perspective of being able to hold a lot of different views and how do you say a generous attitude towards what people want to do with their spiritual life, as long as it's not harming others, right? But that's not often how we think of secularism in the West. So I still have this question.
Yeah. Well, so then let's go. But I was surprised kind of hearing the Dalai Lama always has such a beautiful way of seeing things. So I wanted to start out with that, because it was very nice. And that the idea of India does have a lot of problems, but it's the biggest democracy in the world. 1 billion people, and it's kind of a cool model for where society can go. It's very messy, but it's quite religious on one side, quite secular on another, quite poor, and then quite rich. It's an extraordinarily dynamic society. So secularism usually means without belief, that you. But the thing is, you can't define a friend of mine, Bjarke Engels, this great architect who's a friend of mine, he says, if you only define yourself by what you're against, you're just a follower in reverse. So like that's the thing. If you define yourself against religion, like what's the selfish gene guy? Richard Dawkins, for example. I've seen him I saw him give a talk right when that book came out a long time ago. It was one of my first real intellectual talks I got to see as an adult. And it was so anti, that's the thing. It's so violently against religion. And that's okay. That's his perspective. But then you can't figure out what he's for. So that's the thing about. So I think defining secularism, like from my own sort of, I guess you'd say, Snibbe flavor of secularism, is more about acknowledging what it's for, which is I would tend to say, and these are the kind of people who come to the Skeptics Path podcasts and classes and things like that. They're generally people who don't believe in anything that can't be proven by science. And I think, and science, psychology, and of course, there's a lot of things that we'll discover later that science will establish, maybe even past and future lives in other realms, and who knows, or that the consciousness is at the root of the universe, something like that. But right now, we don't have any scientific evidence for things like that. So that's the working definition of secularism that I tend to use, in my work, in teaching meditation and running the podcast, is people who only believe in what science, modern science and psychology can establish. So based on that ground, what kind of spirituality can you have? Can you even have? And then you have to define spirituality, right? So I tend to define spirituality as the invisible. Like ever since I was a little kid, I was more interested in the invisible things than the visible, and things like infinity or love or consciousness and things like that. So I think you can define spirituality in a secular form, without saying that it's about a soul or a God or anything like that, and just say it's about the immaterial things in life. There are things that are immaterial, yet still exist. And I like starting out with math. Math is immaterial. There's no math detector. The math describes the way the universe works better than any other method that we've come up with, but it doesn't exist anywhere. Math, it does exist, but it doesn't exist in a material form. It's immaterial. Yeah. Love is immaterial also, right? Like the love isn't in our neurons or in a texted emoji heart or something like that. It's something immaterial. So I think you can walk people towards spirituality quite quickly once you accept that there are immaterial things and it's not supernatural. Ideas, emotions. There are effects. There are simultaneous material causes and effects that relate to emotions, like neurons firing and words coming out of our mouth and so on. But the actual emotion, the actual mathematics, and then also more spiritual ideas of consciousness and how to evolve your mind. So I think that's like the gentle walk for a secular person towards spirituality is taking only what we understand scientifically as a basis, and then also realizing that there are immaterial things that aren't ghosts or gods or souls. There's a lot of real immaterial things. Even computer programs are immaterial. They're a configuration of energy moving through computer systems. The program is not the computer, but where's the program, right? It's actually immaterial. It's a kind of configuration of information that correlates with material changes, but isn't wholly that matter.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, I love those examples. I often use the example in the same department. I use the examples of gravity.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, and I also like to guide a meditation for people imagining the color red or imagining a red or blue ball. And, yes, the brain and physiology and all of that, help to produce the color red in the mind or the color blue or even the image of a ball. But that the image itself in the mind, the actual blue ball, meaning, where did that come from? What is that? And then we get into this discussion on, because Buddhism is mostly interested in mind. I mean, really, like the whole Buddhist corpus is talking about, I don't know how many, 70% mind, 75% mind, and so it's, and
it's the first topic, I think that's actually what's tricky. Like the first topic really is the mind, because and that's what you start to realize is that there is all of our reality is psychological, right? Well, you were talking about the color red. So there is no red out in the world. And you can argue with people about it, but red is a vibration of invisible electromagnetic energy at a certain frequency that comes through your eye and comes through your senses, and then your brain interprets as a quality. Once it gets to that sense of a quality of red, we're in a total no man's land of absolutely not understanding what that is. This is what David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness, which is how do the configuration of neurons in our brain relate to the subjective experience of red, sweet, love, or just subjectivity itself. Just the sense that I am here and I'm observing and experiencing something. Nobody's explained that yet, and it may take hundreds of years. Dr. Rick Hansen, he's very humble in his book Buddha's Brain. That's a great book on neuroscience and Buddhism. And he says, it may be 350 years. He says, if you look at the beginning of physics, the earliest Western Enlightenment physics like Galileo, then Einstein, 100 years ago, it took us about 350 years to bring physics to the point where it is today, which has an extraordinary understanding of material reality. And we're probably much earlier. Like we've only really started studying consciousness and the brain in the last 20 or 30 years. So he says 300 years. I don't know if it'll take that long, but it's realistic. It's realistic.
Yeah. I mean, I don't mean to be dismissive, but I often say, like, modern mind science, in the Western world, it's really in its infant stages. There's much more advanced Western, like physics is a very advanced field, where kind of brain science is still in the beginning. And I think the best scientists who study the brain would admit that, like wonderful. There's going back a bit, I was kind of. I have my own take on this, which I don't know if I want to share too much. I more just want to hear what you say. But I guess I have I always have like hypotheses I'm working with, or sort of, my perspectives are always changing. And I think for me, being an explorer of the mind and reality, trying to emphasize that in my practice, I always have to leave open questions. I can't sort of, if I nail something down, I notice, I get stuck. I start to lose openness. Yeah. I start to lose that inquisitiveness. But I've been kind of flirting with this idea lately that, why I think what you're talking about is more of a skillful means, for people who are, let's say they practice the religion of science. I'll just be blunt, and they, without knowing it, they don't know they practice the religion of science, but they do. And then, it's an entrance point. It's like, hey, there's this whole tradition that explores the mind and explores reality. And you can do that, safely, from your boat. and then of course, if people want to offer them an opportunity to open their bias or limiting perspective. But yeah, I kind of have this notion. I'm kind of like, more and more I think Buddhism is both a religion and a spiritual path and a science. I think it has all these aspects. So we can't just say Buddhism is one thing. It has different aspects to it, but the way I like to approach Buddhism personally, and sometimes when I'm guiding people, is something that's beyond secularism or religion, and kind of just like approaching it that way, just approaching it from the standpoint of, hey, like here's some things to reflect on, and introducing tools like analytical meditation, Qigong, Jogong, resting meditation, other aspects to kind of just explore the mind. And I almost think we're kind of we're almost ready for that. Culturally, because I think we're seeing, a lot of us are seeing the limitations of belief. We're seeing the limitations of fixation on ideologies and political, posturing and all this stuff. And I think a lot of us are just sick of that. And we want to find another way to be in the world. I'm sick of that, so I don't know.
Yeah, well, what you say in terms of people believing in science, Houston Smith calls this scientism, which is the idea. It's an irrational belief that there is a materialist explanation for every phenomena in the universe, because of course it hasn't been established that everything can be explained and broken down into material causes. But there are people who believe that. Not all scientists believe it. Lots of scientists are, because true curious scientists, they just accept whatever we've discovered right now, along with its provisionality. David Deutsch is one of my very favorite scientists, and he wrote a book called The Beginning of Infinity, and it's all about the progression of scientific knowledge. And what he says is that there's no such thing as a true scientific theory. There's only less wrong. We just go from wrong to less wrong theories. And even our current theories, like the theory of relativity, that will probably be subsumed one day by some other theory. So it's not like relativity is just the same way Newtonian. I mean, maybe it's better to talk about things that have already been subsumed. So you start with Newtonian. The relativity and quantum mechanics are incompatible. But think about Newtonian physics. It was later completely replaced with relativity, which solves all the same problems and more. So is Newton wrong and Einstein right? Sort of, but Einstein's also wrong too. Like that's the perspective of someone like David Deutsch, is that there's an infinite. All the evidence shows us is there's an infinite progression of knowledge possible in the universe. So we will never have a final correct answer. We only have more and more accurate models that help us, predict and explain the world around us. And so that's why it's nice to be open to many different types of inquiry. That's what Buddhism offers is that science right now doesn't, so most of it doesn't so much accept subjective experience as a high standard of evidence. Like people do perform scientific studies that rely on subjective experience, filling out questionnaires and telling about it. But those generally aren't considered the strongest scientific. It's the ones where we can use an external instrument to measure something. But the thing is, what our aspirations as human beings are much greater than what science could lead us to today. There isn't a scientific method for being happy yet, or having a good relationship, even having a meaningful life. So that's the beauty of Buddhism, is that it developed this to such an extraordinarily refined level. And it offers you these practices. And really all you have to do is provisionally accept the hypothesis that my subjective experience is extremely valid if you can tune it. If you can, you can trick yourself and tell yourself lies all the time. But yet you just become aware of that. You become attuned to that too. You accept all that, and you can surf really deeply in your own mind and steer your own mind in a way that no scientific method is capable of yet. And the scientific methods that have been capable of doing that have done it by borrowing from Buddhism. They've extracted small bits like mindfulness, compassion, figured out a way to systematize them in a laboratory, measure brain correlates of parts of your brain that are correlated with being more empathetic or compassionate, and then you can publish a paper and say, if you use this Buddhist method, your brain grows in this region, and that growth is correlated with people who are happier and more compassionate. But you don't need that big. It's really incredible and wonderful that science is doing that. But as an individual human, it's quite a desperate situation where we need to address these issues with our craving and anger and also joy and happiness and meaning right now. Our lives are happening right now, and we can't wait 350 years for science to validate Mahamudra or something like that. So, but luckily, again, this is where there's this nice convergence where Buddhism does consider itself, especially in the lineage we're in, a science of the mind. And the primary tool is the mind itself, that there's a way to have the mind look at the mind and not be deceived. And you go really, really deeply into that. But essentially, that's the essence of meditation, right? It's the mind looking at the mind. And that itself is a huge revelation, because you start to have doubts about certain things, I must not really be my thoughts and feelings if I can observe them. If I can get a third person perspective on my thoughts and feelings, then there's some other aspect to myself that isn't those. So it's one of the first things I think that can really free you in meditation, is realizing I'm not my thoughts, that I can just watch them and decide which ones I want to follow. It's amazing that it's hard, obviously. I've been practicing 22 years or whatever, and I get carried away with certain things still. But I was talking to Venerable Renee the other day. We were talking about anger. I was talking to him about anger. I was talking about the different delusions and how to fight them, and he said, anger is the easy one, isn't it? Because, it feels so bad. So you just let it pass. I'm like, yeah, okay. All right.
It's easy to recognize that it sucks
Yeah.
out of all the emotions, I think we're like, this feels bad. I can understand. But then working with it is difficult. That's hard. Yeah.
But there's this incredible, this incredible verse from Shantideva where he said, if things came into being by choice, then no one would suffer. So that is, the things that Shantideva said are so mind-blowing. You could just take one thing that Shantideva said and think about it your whole life. But that one is so profound. Just to think about that. Wow. You realize I am not in control of my own mind, because of course I want to be happy. That's number one. I definitely want to be happy. And I think I'm choosing to be happy, but somehow it's not working. I don't have the skill. I don't have the skill and the method to be happy, to benefit others, to do things. I think we all really do want to benefit others, but how often does it backfire? How often do you try, You try to so many
Yeah.
so many conflicts happen from two people actually trying to benefit each other, two people trying to benefit each other, but just doing it in a way that really annoys the other person.
Yeah, for me, more and more, this is just how I see the world.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a few things around this, and I want to go back to a little bit on
Sure.
our discussion about science, but it's for me until we've done enough work with our own individual experience to see that we don't have the freedom to choose because we're being controlled by our habits, behaviors, and what we call kleshas in Sanskrit,
Yeah.
or disturbing emotions. And until we realize that's a prison, I don't know if the practice goes anywhere so profound. I mean, so this is kind of like a big subject I'm thinking about, and it's not like. And then, of course, like that connects into seeing like, oh, other people are in their own prison too. Like your prison is not the same as my prison,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, it's a prison, and a prison of mind. And then, of course, Buddhism, the Buddha taught, and there's a way out of that prison. That's the most important part. But I think, the focus, some of that focus, for me, it's like this, just using that as an example, it's a subjective where all the richness comes out. So what's interesting for me is, I totally agree with you, because I think, the work that Dalai Lama has done with the Mind and Life Institute and all his work with scientists over the years and trying to find common ground. And as you say, like the spirit of genuine scientists is one of openness and open questions and discovery and not knowing the answer, et cetera. And I really think that's amazing. And I would call them also explorers of reality for that reason.
Yeah.
But there's still a reliance on the objective, which actually, to me, that inherently makes it material. I mean, that approaches everything, innately from a materialist perspective, where the subjective gets a lot more interesting because it starts to go beyond the immaterial, because we start to look at, the mind and how we get caught up. If I take the word prison might be a little triggering. So just the mind, as we get caught up in our own stuff and our own identities and ego clinging and thoughts and ideas. But when we become a discoverer of that, we see how much of that is immaterial. And so we start to realize we need to work in the immaterial. That's what the discovery becomes. I don't know about for you, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what you're talking about is like the middle of the path is renunciation.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, when the Buddha taught, he taught these Four Noble Truths right away. But when we put them in the order of the Lam Rim, it's sort of toward the middle, and where you face this really kind of scary step of renunciation. Which what does that mean? And you're describing how we learn about renunciation in our tradition, which is not renouncing. I like to quote Alex Beretson. He had a beautiful explanation of this in a book called The Gelug Kagyu Tradition of Mahamudra.
Yeah.
And he says
Great
renunciation isn't giving up something trivial like ice cream or giving up something really something less trivial like making love to your partner or having friends and things like that. It's giving up our delusions. Mm-hmm. It's giving up attachment, especially these three poisons: attachment, anger, and ignorance. And in some way, I found that very freeing when I saw that, because I think a lot of people think, and by the way, some other Buddhist traditions do have the view of renunciation that it is trying to step away as much as possible from material things. Yeah, in our tradition, it's a little different. Yeah.
Well, if I could just interject for a second, I mean, this is where I think we can also go into some other conversation on how rich the Buddhist path can be with this explorative, how do you say it, view-based perspective, where we're holding open questions, and the practices, the ritual, vows, or ethics are all in relationship to this. So, just to give you a quick example, and then sorry to interrupt you, but because I think often they get mistaken as this, because in the beginning, there's like, okay, do this and don't do this. We take ethics as part of the path, but for me, at this point, after reflecting on this for a long time, I see them differently. I do not see them as rules. I see them as boundaries to work one's mind with, to see how and what are the causes of suffering and how to work more skillfully with them. So then in a sense, renouncing, let's say, like I was a monk for 9 years, so renouncing certain things, being a monk, yes, in the beginning, that very much felt like, rejecting
Yeah.
something on the outer level. But now I think of it much differently. It's just sort of like it's in relation to like a boundary or a path to help see the mind. And in that sense, it points to the same renunciation we're talking about. Like it points
Yeah.
to the ultimate renunciation we're referring to, which is understanding that the mind binds itself or frees itself. But it's interesting because I'd like to use this as a jumping off point for our conversation too, because, the Buddhist path is not just like sitting practice, as you said. There's analytical meditation. There's also ritual. There's vows and ethics. There's cultural aspects. And, when, if we're talking about, I often see like the wish to secularize Buddhism or sort of like make it more applicable. But for me, it's already applicable. We just have to understand why we're using these different things. And then, of course, make them culturally appropriate. So sorry to sidetrack our conversation, but
Oh yeah, no. I mean, there's so much to say there. Geshe Thupten Lodin, who wrote my favorite book on Lamrim, Meditations on the Path to Enlightenment, he says you're more likely to find a bodhisattva at a football game than in a meditation cave. Because of course if you want to benefit beings, you have to be around beings. So yeah, an engaged life, like Thich Nhat Hanh's engaged Buddhism, and an engaged life is the one where you can benefit people the most. But yeah, these ideas of, well, you're talking about ethics, so
yeah, just sort of
I
guess what I'm hinting at, just for the broader conversation, what I'm hinting at is sort of like, again, like how we apply healthy skepticism, even in relation to like, are we just cherry picking the path, or is there like a structure that we want to kind of surrender to a certain extent with a healthy form of skepticism, and you and I both done that to a certain extent. And I think I definitely for me, but I think for you, as we've talked, we've both derived so much benefit out of that.
Yeah.
And I think that it's something that needs to be talked about more. So that's why I'm bringing it up,
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. So the thing is, there are very well-known drawbacks of cherry picking from the Buddhist path. There are huge benefits, obviously. But they're very well-known drawbacks. I'll talk about a couple, right? So one of the drawbacks of cherry picking mindfulness is that it can actually, in some cases, it can lead you to ruminate on your problems. Actually, like if you only teach concentration without how to steer that concentration between one object and another, and there's a few scientific studies out now that show this. That for some people, especially people who don't have the healthiest mind, the meditation's a nightmare. It makes their life much worse because they just treat it like rumination. So pure mindfulness alone, without a little bit of steering, like the people who benefit from mindfulness is that I think they just happen to have a benevolent well in which to experience their mindfulness. So the people that benefit from mindfulness is because they also had an analytical component to their mind naturally. That because many people going to mindfulness meditation would have a good attitude. They wouldn't be doing it to go be able to hold their rifle more steadily. So that's one thing. So just concentration alone can be detached from. It can create rumination, and it can also be detached from ethics. So it would just make you better at doing your job, or better at sleeping, or something like that. But not necessarily at anything virtuous. But even compassion, though, like if you overemphasize compassion, then often people don't know what to do with that compassion, right? Like that's the typical drawback of, and we all know people like this who are so extraordinarily compassionate, but they get overwhelmed. They get overwhelmed by that feeling and confused also, and don't know what to do in the world to ameliorate the problems that they feel very, very strongly. So that's. Yeah.
Sorry, or like you said, I mean, you brought up a really good point earlier. Like when there's not wisdom merged with skillful means, we can often harm more without realizing it. You mentioned that a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you overemphasize wisdom, which a lot of people say is what Steve Jobs did. Like I think Ram Dass said this. He said Steve Jobs was kind of like all emptiness and no compassion. So, which I don't think that's true. I know people who worked with Steve Jobs and just loved him, but that can be the case. Like if you only go into one form of wisdom, then you are it's kind of cold. It's kind of cold and analytical, and it lacks like the warmth of applying that. So like that's why you need a whole path. That's why I would say it is difficult, and in general, it is beneficial to cherry pick and use all these techniques, because in general, it's the alternative to somebody just kind of thinking about chasing their attachment and anger and so on.
Yeah,
but for them to actually work together, it works as the Buddhist path is complicated, at least the way we learned it.
Very complicated.
And all these pieces do fit together in an extraordinary way. Like I don't even like one of those incredible 3-dimensional puzzles, that are like very hard to solve. Like gradually, as you study Buddhism, it's so beautiful the way you see that every element fits into the next. So you do need these kind of 8 or 9 topics, I think, to make sense of it in our tradition. Not that you can't benefit from parts, but to really reap the complete benefit, it's because you can see how any one of them just starts veering. Any one subject starts veering a little bit off the rails. Like if you only think about impermanence, you can become a kind of nihilist, like, woohoo, let's go do whatever we want tonight. Like who cares, impermanence? You need to combine it with the other aspects of the path.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and they benefit each other. I mean, the aspects of the paths also serve other aspects, and also something I've been kind of harping on lately, which this relates to, is I think when we're shopping, like when we're spiritually shopping, I don't think there's a problem with cherry picking, because we're just trying different things and kind of like seeing, hey, what resonates with me, what kind of viewpoint, what blah, blah, blah. But at some point, we need some structure, because otherwise, like as you're saying, we're not deepening in anything. It's not connected to anything. Or in worst case scenario, it can kind of like, emphasize, it can go the wrong direction, because it's getting too overbearing in one department. But, there's that's what I was going to say. There's this kind of also something I'm thinking about too, which is, I think sometimes meditation gets co-opted by technique, and for me, actually, meditation techniques. This is a little controversial. I got a YouTube video coming out about it soon. We'll see how people respond. I kind of believe meditation techniques in and of themselves are dead ends, if they're not connected to a view and then a wider path, as we're describing.
Yeah,
and so kind of like in our conversation, where we're talking about then like how do we approach that where we're not necessarily just switching our belief system from one belief system to another, which is that's a whole, for me, that's been a whole journey. So I mean, that's also another way to think about
no, the view is very important. It's worth backing up to mention there's an approach to the world and there's an approach to your mind in Buddhism. I just heard a really nice little video with Alan Wallace talking about it very articulately. And he said, the view of ethics, Buddhist does have an ethical view. It can be quite elaborate, obviously, like what do you do in the world? But he boiled it down very simply. He just said the Buddhist view of ethics is nonviolence and benevolence, is that your actions do not harm, and that the things that you do are meant to help. That's Buddhist ethics in a nutshell, actually. And you don't hear things like that articulated that much. Like it's pretty sad in our culture that isn't at the basis of our political systems, our moral systems. It's the basis of our culture is don't break the laws. Like essentially, as long as you're not stepping on anyone else's toes, like do whatever you want.
Yeah,
that is our ethic. That's the kind of enlightenment era, not Buddhist enlightenment, but Western enlightenment, right?
The enlightenment of the individual, like the individual,
the individual.
Centering the individual.
Thupten Jinpa talks about. He gave this amazing talk in like 2017 that I love about this. Very gently, analyzing the progression of Western, politics, particularly in political systems, in civilization, and how we have a society, a civilization. It's not just a nation, but a civilization that has that is mostly ethics free. That there, except for very extreme things like taking someone else's life, stealing from like material physical harm is prohibited. But besides that, do whatever you want. Cut down all the trees on your land. Pour oil into the oceans. Pay people as little as you want, right? Like those things none of those things are embedded in our system. So he advocates quite strongly for those things moving into the political realm, that those become embedded in our laws, You know, that morality actually, because it is so intrinsic. The Buddhist view is it's intrinsic to existence, that if you actually want to be a happy individual, you need to have nonviolence and benevolence at your core. And imagine if those aren't in the Declaration of Independence, you know, in the US. It's the pursuit of happiness, but it doesn't say how to pursue happiness. And it turns out to really be happy, you need this ethical foundation. And then there's also a meditative, you know, an extraordinary inner path that we've been mostly talking about, which is how to find the depths of happiness and meaning within your own mind. Like, this is an extraordinary place to explore.
Yeah, beautifully said. And and it's interesting because I think, you know, it's been a journey for me, just trying to like not like reprogram, but like understand or break apart the views of how I was taught, or culturally, you know, just, I don't think we're even taught a lot of these things. We just pick them up as we grow up. You know, we pick them up. Not even some of us who weren't even, you know, didn't even grow up with like very intense religious, you know, dogma. We still end up in this view of ethics as like a set of rules, as a set of like what's defining us as a good or bad person, as opposed to like what's defining us as in connection with the world.
Yeah.
And really in Buddhism, for me, ethics really just come down to like recognizing recognizing cause and effect. There is an effect for everything that we do. And if you don't recognize that, not only is it unskillful because we can experience a lot of suffering and cause a lot of suffering, it's a form of nihilism. It's a form of, you know, if we don't recognize that. So but it's different because it's like, I'll bring this in. You know, I teach Buddha nature a lot, even though Buddha nature is one of the most difficult subjects in Buddhism to teach. So I'll just say I like to talk about it, but I'm also reticent to talk about it because it's so deep, and often Buddha nature can get misunderstood as a soul or some kind of other ego-based thing. But anyways, for me, just introducing it here a little bit in our conversation, you know, the basic premise is that we are not fundamentally flawed, that we are fundamentally, you know, at our nature, our basic nature, are okay, and then that's interesting because then we still have a relative world that is based on cause and effect, and that we have to interact with and accept those realities to a certain degree, and use them to our advantage to reconnect with our Buddha nature. I mean, I think of Buddhist ethics as a very skillful teaching of the Buddha to help reconnect us to our Buddha nature. Similar to how you said, like we start to naturally see what's advantageous to the mind as opposed to natural to the mind. So But Robert Thurman, you know, he always has such beautiful ways of putting this. He has a new book called Wisdom is Bliss, his latest book. And he talks about that bias. He says the universe is biased towards connection. And acts of connection are what make you happy. So the ultimate act of connection is, you know, giving someone something, hugging someone, you know, just love, kindness, generosity. The ultimate act of disconnection is killing somebody, right? So he said, and that, I think that really is the Buddhist view, is that these actions is like the universe itself is biased towards connection and away from disconnection. And if you look at the Earth, you know, the whole biosphere, especially kind of pre-industrial biosphere, you can see that. Like, of course, things are killing each other all the time. But in general, the great majority of life is biased towards connection and growth. So you bring up the point of cause and effect. That is really the topic that helps with the biggest delusions that people have today. Because what is the most common thing that you hear when people are frustrated about something in the world? They say, I can't believe so-and-so did so-and-so. Right? Yeah. So if you ever catch yourself saying, I can't believe X, it's ignorance. It's just ignorance. Of course, you know, it's just that you're not working hard enough. Sorry to put this kind of bluntly, but it's no,
like you're not working hard enough to think, because the person's not crazy, actually. Some are a little bit crazy, but we're all crazy. We're actually all a little bit crazy. Like, that person
but even
has a
so,
logic.
there's cause and effect happening in that craziness, right?
Yeah, like if they are crazy, then you shouldn't be angry at them because they're actually crazy. But you can understand why people do. You can totally understand why Donald Trump does things. It's not that hard. He wears it on his sleeve what his values are and what he cares about. It's quite clear why he does things. And it's quite clear why the people that follow him do those things. And if you really try to understand someone, you can't be angry at them. Tara Brach says this is like the state of curiosity. The opposite of anger is curiosity, she says. It's actually not like patience. I mean, I like it. It's one way of talking, right? Of course. But she's like, when you're in a curious state of mind, you can't be angry. And I have to say that is one thing Buddhism has really helped me with, is that for so much in life, more than when I was younger, that I do feel this curiosity more than anything else of like, why are they doing that? And you can figure it out. Like, it's not that hard to figure out why Donald Trump did something, or why your neighbor is fighting you about something. You just totally put your head in their head, let go of your point of view, and just look from there. It doesn't mean they're right, but they do have that. Like, you have to acknowledge it exists, that their point of view exists, and they have an internal logic to what they're doing. And today, so many people, like, we live in such an oppositional culture today where a lot of younger activists today are even saying they refuse to empathize, that even to think about their opponent's point of view diminishes their ability to oppose it. And Buddhism would say that's not the case. You're much more effective at opposing anything, racism, classism, injustice, if you really understand the other side. And once you do, you tend to not really be angry about it. You can be forceful and effective, but it's hard to really be angry that you see cause and effect, and you also see that arguing with people does not solve problems in general. There's very, very few examples that argument or any kind of rationalizing. This is where liberals often have a lot of problems. They try to make a rational argument why their political case is correct, and it will never work. No rational argument for anything in general will ever work on anybody. What moves people are stories, and stories are based on kind of emotions. And that's the power of the Buddhist. It really tunes your ability to empathize. And you see the people who made the biggest impact in life, they were able to empathize. Like people like Gandhi, Martin Luther King, like they were for everybody. They were even for their opponents, right? Like they were for humanity. They had their core group. Yeah,
even one could argue they weren't. I think what you said earlier still stands, which is that they were highly intelligent and highly skillful at understanding the other side, and actually had a desire to do that. For me, a lack of desire to do that. It's similar to you. For me, probably like that's one of the biggest things I've gotten out of Buddhism is curiosity, for sure. Yeah. Just like a more curious spirit, and the more I explore that, actually, the more happy I get. Because there's just this sense of like openness we can come to, an experience, and we don't have to believe our judgments, but we can still have ideas and perspectives, and that's fine. And we can iterate on those ideas and perspectives, and we can act from them. Like you said, we don't want to just sit in like open question curiosity forever. We need to take action sometimes. But I think your point is wonderful that, if we're taking action from a limited bias and viewpoint, watch out. To me, that's what, there's also this sense of like, it's very connected to like, for me, it's very also related to this sense of like, when that becomes smaller, when views become smaller, or the ability to open to wider views, the compassion becomes smaller. This sense of like what you're saying, Robert Thurman said, that this natural law of connection in the universe, our recognition of that becomes cut off or smaller. And it's really, honestly, if I were to say like what I think one of the biggest problems in the world is right now, I would say that. I would say this is driving a lot of modern problems, including climate change. So
no, absolutely. And it comes from a confusion, because you can fundamentally believe in every single person on earth has the right to a dignified health, health insurance, food, clothing, shelter, not to be oppressed, to be able to think and move freely. Like everybody, to believe that, like I'm not convinced everyone even believes that. That's the thing, because do you think of the politician you hate or somebody like that, right? That you really need that ground, but that doesn't mean you can't be bias in your everyday action. You have a few people that you're involved with. For most of us, it's our family, our friends, our colleagues. Of course, those are the people we're going to most deeply and powerfully influence and care about, and actually actively care about. But to have it in the back of your mind that everybody deserves that everybody deserves happiness, kindness, wealth, security, justice. My friend Kim Stanley Robinson, an extraordinary science fiction author, he's written this in a couple of his books, that he says humanity hasn't even begun. He says humanity hasn't even begun until so everybody has those basic human rights of clothing, shelter, health insurance, food, security, the right to think freely and to live their life without being harmed or oppressed. It actually doesn't come out that much. It would be nice, I think. It would be nicer if that was more clearly at the basis. That's what we call equanimity. And this is one of these other topics in Buddhism, is equanimity. It comes before love and compassion. That's part of the problem, actually, is a lot of people jump to a very advanced practice of compassion. But the earlier practice of equanimity is off the chart. It knocks it out of the park. Just that. Yeah. Just a world of equanimity where people didn't have love and compassion for everybody, but they just fundamentally believed in everyone's rights, everyone's fundamental human rights. It's kind of socialist, for people to get angry.
Yeah, there's
about
a Buddhist
the word
teacher
socialist.
I'm thinking of, who I'm not going to name, but he doesn't. Yeah. He doesn't believe in human rights. Not that he doesn't believe people should be happy. He just kind of questions this idea of human rights.
Yeah,
as a thing.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, we won't go there. I'm gonna leave that there.
But I really like that, and it's just to be able to look at everyone that way, even your enemies. They can still be your enemies. There's no problem. Yeah. But it's just understanding that they are trying to be happy. They're acting probably from a very misguided view of what will make them happy, that harming others will make them happy. And then you look at them and they aren't actually happy. Yeah, so it's kind of proof in point. Well, they just have faulty logic of ethics and the mind.
Yeah, but one thing you're kind of that's a little bit implicit in what you're saying too is, I think a recognition between subject, because we can go back to this kind of subjective objective dynamic or paradox, which is, I find that to be a problem of an idea or belief or ethic or whatever we want to say, being objective and not having been brought into the subjective. You gave this example, so many of us have so many opinions about the world and politics and social issues and blah, blah, blah. And yet we don't know how to be kind to our own family,
Yeah.
And so it's you know what I mean? It's for me, I'm talking about me here. I struggle in my intimate relationships. They're not easy all the time. And I'm just really realizing this is where it's at. This is, it's not out there and supposedly doing major world transformations. I'm trying to transform myself and then relate to my immediate environment with more benevolence.
Yeah, I agree with that. The most difficult is in this intimate sphere with the relation, your intimate relationships, and a lot of people. I think this is where the secular Buddhism and people non lay practitioners, what you'd say, that is the biggest challenge, because so much of the conflict and desire and anger of almost everything else in the world, honestly, has very much diminished for me over the years. And it really works, Buddhism. But the intimate relationship is really, really tricky, because the person's always there. You're always together, and somehow we choose each other. You can't help but show your delusions and see, your partner's delusions. And there are, quote, simple techniques for dealing with that. Richard Prince, a great, senior practitioner in our kind of realm of Dharma friends, he says mindfulness and compassion. As something is happening, apply mindfulness so that so it doesn't immediately take over your mind, So just, okay, what is going on? I'm feeling, a part of my mind is feeling criticized, angry, whatever. And then compassion, so live with it, live with that through mindfulness. Accept that it's there. Don't let it take over your mind. you stop at what's called the mental factor of feeling, which is just that you can recognize that there's a negativity or a positivity to what's going on in your mind. And then compassion, like, whoa, what's the most compassionate thing I can do in this situation? And sometimes you need to slow down and be like, okay, let me go think for about an hour about what to do. But I love that formula. I'm not always able to apply it, but I think it's very skillful and quite simple, actually. It's a simple explanation of how to live your life, how to live ethically. But yeah, it's very difficult because there's so much attachment in relationships. Like, why are you in a relationship? What got you into the relationship? And a lot of the times it's attachment. It's what Renee, when I got divorced, I was married once before. Mm-hmm. And I asked Renee kind of about relationships, as that was happening. I said, if I get into another relationship, like, what's your advice? And he said, well, you should have a common purpose with your partner. He said, you really want to have some common purpose in life. I think we rarely hear that about relationships. Most relationship advice is actually how to get something, like how to get the perfect partner, that you like, the whole list of qualities that you require from your partner, and go find that person and get in a relationship with them. But I really liked Renee's where he said, find a common purpose with your life. And to a big extent, my wife and I do that. We do have so much in common in terms of what we think the purpose of life is. And that really does keep us, I think, keeps us bound together. We've known each other for 22 years. We've been together for since 2017, so 15 years. And we fight, we have our arguments, but we really work at it and use all kinds of techniques, like Buddhist and non-Buddhist. There's all kinds of great frameworks now. Scientists have studied relationships and have a lot of good advice on like how to treat each other in a way that keeps bringing you closer rather than further away.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot to say here, but beautiful. I love how you're approaching it. And yeah, for me, it's like, I mean, again, when we're working with our subjective experience in relationship, which is always there, it's sort of like, who wouldn't be our main practice, but our intimate, close ones and family and work and stuff like that. But, there's this other element of, I was just going to say something briefly, of like, choice, because I think you brought this up a little bit, where a lot of us we don't choose with kind of like our more clear thinking mind. We choose via our delusion. We choose out of attachment, or some people don't have choice who they marry. That's a whole nother issue, right? Probably like an older issue in human society. It's less prevalent now. But let's just assume we choose. We usually choose out of attachment. And one thing I've thought about with partners often is like, I'm kind of choosing more or less kind of a guru, not necessarily like they're explicitly my guru or spiritual teacher, but it's like they're the mirror for me every day to look at my mind and see how, where I'm being deplorable and where I can grow and where I thrive and how to, work both of those out. But, I kind of look at that, probably we should wrap up soon. So if it's okay, I wanted to kind of go back to this. If you had any kind of remaining thoughts or things to share on healthy skepticism in our approach to the Buddhist path. We shared a lot about it, but I think, that being the theme of our conversation, there's so much to say. Obviously we could probably have like 10 of these episodes easily and go through kind of how we both approach that. So we're just sharing, just for those of you listening, Scott and I are just sharing a little bit about it. But anything you want to say, anything, you forgot to say or I didn't ask? Or
healthy skepticism.
In relation to the path, in relation to the practice of the path, anything more you can say about it?
Well, I think the things that people tend to be skeptical about are the ones that aren't part of our worldview, like past and future lives, other realms, including like hells and heaven type realms, and karma, the idea that everything you do plants a seed that then has to ripen in some way in the future, including mostly in future lives. Those are the things that are really hard and they're really embedded in, at least our form of Buddhism. They're very deeply embedded in like the very first topics you study. It's quite difficult. The precious life, the first topic in one version of the Lam Rim. It starts with all those three things in the first sentence. so yeah, I mean, I think the skepticism, everything is about this middle way. In our tradition, they use this phrase, the middle way, a lot, and I think it's very reasonable to be skeptical. It would be worse to just accept them blindly, because then what are you doing? How do you decide to accept things blindly? Like some people blindly believe that if you fly a plane into a building, you're going to go to heaven. So it's quite
not just
difficult.
heaven. You're going to have 40 virgins.
Yeah. Let's not go there. Yeah, but so it's quite reasonable to be skeptical about blind belief, and I think those things are it's very reasonable to set them aside for years or maybe even your whole life, with Buddhism, because there are some arguments and logic and directly and things you can do directly in experience and meditation to probe those questions honestly. And I think they're very fun. So I think that skepticism is not cynicism. So cynicism is when you outright reject something. You kind of reject everything. So it's quite difficult to work with cynics because they say no to everything before you even know what it is. So skepticism, I call it rational skepticism, where you're critical yet open. So you're open to really any idea, but you test it. You test it with logic. You test it with experiments. I think the thing in Buddhism is that you also test things through meditation and through direct experience. So that's where you have to decide if that's a valid way to test things for you. The Buddhism's the only religion I know where the founder said, don't trust everything I say. He said, test everything for yourself. And so you really are invited to that. But the way to test it is subjective, and it also could take a long time. You're not going to sit down once and meditate on cause and effect and all of a sudden understand how what's behind every person's actions on the planet. Right? It take a long time. So I think that's one aspect of skepticism. Is totally reasonable to be skeptical about the kind of currently unprovable aspects of Buddhism, unprovable with science.
But what I'm hearing, sorry, Scott,
go on.
For the audience, what I'm hearing you say is that it's not skepticism doesn't mean not believing it. It means not taking it on face value and actually doing the work subjectively to reflect again. Again, like how I put this sometimes, just to talk a little bit, is I'm kind of like I'm putting a mirror in front of my own belief, and the mirror is maybe the Buddhist belief, right? And then I'm checking both, So it's kind of like that's how I think of subjectivity. Is sort of like it's a tennis match with our own with our own thoughts and beliefs, right? Which I found so beneficial because it wears away at my own rigidity. And again, I'm not saying it wears it away and then I can be the best Buddhist ever. No, it wears away both, actually, essentially. At some point.
Yeah. And then the other side too, because when I asked Robert Thurman about skepticism, he always says be skeptical of science, which is actually quite reasonable too, because scientists are skeptical of science. And it doesn't mean that you are a climate denier or that you deny the theory of evolution or something like that. There's an extraordinary amount of evidence. And if you go look at that yourself, those things are true. Or, true to the propensity of 99.99999% probable, if you want to stick with probabilities.
Sure.
But yeah, I think it's also to be skeptical, because how many times do we hear these contradictory results? Science is quite young and things keep getting contradicted. Relativity was this theory that was so amazing, and then it got contradicted almost immediately by quantum mechanics, and no one has resolved that contradiction yet. No one could figure out how these two theories interact. It's been 100 years, and science is still trying to figure out how these two most extraordinary physical theories ever devised in humanity they contradict each other. So how the heck do you integrate them? So those are the two things. Is it's reasonable to be skeptical. But skepticism, the kind of nice form of skepticism we're talking about is an open one, where you go in and explore like directly with your and even ideas like past and future lives. With Skeptic's Path, I started out like very, very purely secular, but I did these episodes later where we actually do the meditation, trying to figure out what happened before you were born, but without any certainty, without a lama saying, you were in the bardo and then you reborn, whatever, but actually just going with curiosity, like doing that meditation. So we have a meditation called continuity of consciousness, where you think about where you were yesterday and the day before, the week, the month, the year, is a really powerful meditation. And you don't have to believe in anything to do this. You can trace your whole life backwards, and then you go back into your mom, and then you shrink down, and then you just ask with curiosity. This version of it is a little different, than the Buddhist version, because then you just ask, you get to that moment of maybe your first awareness, where you first had some sense of consciousness, and just curious, where, when, what, use your imagination. When was that? Where was that? What happened? And then, when the sperm and egg, going backward in time, the sperm and egg go apart, from where they, and then what was I before? And just ask that question. It's a really good question to ask without, and there's no way we can find an answer, right? Like realistically, there's basically no way any of us will know for certain.
Yeah, the furthest, I do that practice a lot. The furthest I've gotten is an inference. There's just an inference. That's all. That's that's the furthest you can get. Yeah.
But to do so in a slightly, secular way, to just ask that question openly. Like see where your imagination goes, and go to a different place day to day. And the thing that Buddhism says is just that practice of doing that is very, very beneficial for your mind. You'd never have to find an answer, but asking the question, instead of just living blindly, kind of not even asking the question, asking that question curiously and being open to not knowing, like that wonder of because even the idea that your consciousness started up from nothing, it's pretty hard to understand or figure out. But if you really, really believe that is pretty extraordinary and miraculous too. Even just to sit with that and think, nothing, how did my awareness emerge from that? If that's what you decide, whatever, great. But spend a lot of time with it and see how that feels and how it makes you think about your life. And
I like that. And as you know, in the Madhyamaka or middle way tradition of Buddhist reasoning and logic and all that, you also have to have some rationale for why then it would be. That's what I find the important piece. If we're doing this on a thought basis, kind of a thought exercise or meditation, analytical meditation, there has to be that piece where it's like, okay, well then why or how would be the mechanism that something came from nothing?
Exactly.
So I find that to be the richest part, because like you said, we're going through, I think what we're really, the whole essence of our conversation is curiosity itself, and the questions itself and the exploration itself is the path. Like that is the benefit of a lot of what we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think there's a lot of, dismissal in our culture right now, just dismissing things before you even know what they are. And it's nice you can be open and still be effective and strong and have strong opinions and defend people and fight for justice and all of that. Like they aren't incompatible. You can be like very open and very compassionate and still really effective in life, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. Yeah. And my prayers are that, we can find that more and more in our societies, because it's becoming more and more. This is another episode. It's sort of like, is it entrenched, or is that just on social media and in the media, in general? It's hard to really, sometimes it's hard to figure out what is the reality. Like, because when I meet people and you talk to them one-on-one, people are still pretty open. Maybe it's just the people who I meet. And of course they have some rigid beliefs, and so do I, and all of that. But man, like Facebook these days, it's rough. It's almost impossible to have a healthy dialogue on there, in my opinion.
Yeah, and part of it is just the way those platforms are designed. They're polarizing. They tend to encourage polarization because it's hard to see the humanity of the people you're interacting with.
I viewed it as like I started to think of Facebook as a. And I use Facebook, but I started thinking of it as like, I guess this kind of relates to something you said earlier too, is like when we understand the other, when we seek to understand the other person, not that we can understand them fully, but we empathize and we seek to know them and their perspectives and why they feel the way they do. I think it's similar with these, I treat Facebook like that. So I was doing a little bit of an exercise of, well, what is Facebook? I was like, oh, Facebook is like going in the middle of a city and just like holding your sign. And as soon as I started to think of it like that, because I left Facebook and I just recently came back. Yeah. And, I left for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons was that, I didn't have that understanding before. That it's, I thought, somehow in my mind I got confused. And now, not saying I'm correct now, but it feels more healthy because I can just be like, oh yeah, like, of course someone's going to shit on me in the comments because I'm holding a sign in the middle of the street. And in the middle of a city, there's all kinds of people walking. Some people don't care about, you or my ideas at all. Some people hate my ideas. Some people like them. So it's kind of getting on a tangent, but it's just a thought coming out of kind of even skepticism or healthy skepticism applied to sort of how we relate with these different things in our life. And like, I love that you brought that up, that sense of, we have to seek to understand something because then we can actually use it more skillfully. And in my case, I don't know if I'm correct, but it definitely makes me more relaxed when I'm using it. And then I'm not surprised when someone posts a poop meme on my, comments. I'm like, okay, yeah, of course. Like for them, my thing was poop. Great. No problem.
Anyways. It's very rough. It's very rough social media. Someone wouldn't actually do that in real life to you, if they saw
That's
your
what
face.
I mean. Yeah, I actually got into it in the comments, which is like the worst thing you could do, because I was trying to have a rational conversation with someone who I think misunderstood something I had put, and I was just trying to open up a conversation, and it did not go. It's like every time I do that, I'm like I conclude by saying I'm never going to do that ever again, and yet I do it again.
Yeah. There's this phrase, the medium is the message. This, what's his name? The theory, this media theorist from the 60s. His name escapes me right now, like McLaren. Mm-hmm. But what he says is that the medium that you communicate with tends to dominate the discourse. That each medium has a certain kind of bias and power to it, and television is a great example as a one-way delivery medium funded by advertising. It tends to be quite sort of overwhelmingly hypnotic and manipulative, and social media tends to be divisive because it strips away all of the what people rely on for communication are the secondary characteristic, the secondary communication signals.
Yes.
I think it's something like 90% of people, like it's very, very critical to see them. And we look in your eyes and your face, like looking moment by moment, how you're reacting, that the nonverbal aspect of communication is actually the most important one for almost everybody. It's different but there's a small percentage of people for whom those don't matter. Some people who are autistic, actually, like my sister's autistic, but some people who are autistic, they don't pick up on those clues. And it doesn't mean you're like evil or something, actually, but I think
the brain just it can't. There's something in the brain it can't pick up on.
Yeah, like there's very compassionate people actually still who don't pick up on those cues. But in general, most of us are very sensitive to those nonverbal cues, and we don't get any of those in social media. That's what emojis are for. They actually help a little bit, but we don't get those nonverbal cues. So without nonverbal cues, we tend to regress to a more primitive brain, and things more quickly seem like a threat because we're not getting. You need active nonverbal cues that a person is not a threat. Like in Japanese, it's even more. I study Japanese, and there's this thing called aizuchi, which is active listening. So you have to keep saying like yes, 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 yes. Hi, hi, hi in Japanese.
Maybe I'm Japanese because maybe I learned that. I always do that, yeah.
Yes, it's called active listening. And to one extent or another, most of us humans are looking for something like that in order to know that a person's not a threat and that we're connecting with them. And so on social media, we just don't get those except for emoji. So it's actually, again, it's nobody's fault. It's actually the medium's fault. And it was designed by a person who actually I used to work with Mark Zuckerberg. It's designed by a person who doesn't perceive those. Like, he is a person who doesn't perceive those nonverbal cues. So he was, so he designed a system.
Interesting.
Primarily like that. But for people who do care about nonverbal cues, it can bring out the worst in them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, just as we're wrapping up here, any kind of final thoughts on this? Not on social media, but on kind of like healthy skepticism. Anything you want to share? If you want to share more about the course, I know you shared about it before.
Oh yeah, right. Well, we're starting our first course. So I've been trying to adapt this path. We talked about the importance of a complete path. So I tried to adapt the path that we learned, called the Lam Rim, which is like 1,000-year-old path of organizing the Buddha's teaching into who knows how many. You can break it down to 8 or 21 steps. It kind of depends how you break it down. But I've broken it down into about 8 or 9 steps in a secular form. So that course starts on March 5th, if anyone's made it this long in the video to hear. So come and join us. There's a fee for the course, but it's also free to anybody who can't afford it for any reason. So you just ask and you can take the class for free, which is important.
Oh, awesome.
But it's been really, I've been going through the sequence for about 10 years with different people in different places, and they work. These techniques, I think they really work. Yeah. Most of them work in a secular form, and there's something to be said for going 80% there. Because if you go look at like mindfulness or something like that, it's a small percentage, a very small percentage of the Buddhist path, and yet it still has such a huge benefit. So this is trying to go like the step further for people who've tried mindfulness or compassion, to see what it's like to have a complete path, but still not to require any belief. Like to base it in logic. And you do have to dispense with certain important aspects of Buddhist philosophy, like past and future lives. But it's a big step towards the complete Buddhist path for someone that's curious about it, but non-religious.
No, wonderful. Yeah, and what's interesting is even some of those topics, like you brought up karma a little bit, is some of these topics, I mean, they're introduced, but I don't know if even, within the Tibetan system, they're meant to be understood right away, because, it's sort of like, it wasn't like, I'm not saying I understand karma, no way, but I have more understanding than I did about it, than when I first started 23 years ago. And I would say one of the reasons for that is not only just kind of studying the path as a whole and practicing, but also like for me, studies on the middle way, on the Madhyamaka view of really going deep into theory and analytical meditation and emptiness. That actually helped me to understand karma a little bit better. Mm-hmm. But typically we go into studies on emptiness later, because those are more advanced teachings.
Yeah.
But that's what I find is like, I think when we approach this sometimes in a linear way, it runs into these issues, that you're describing. So it's wonderful you're exploring it in different ways for people, because I think reorganizing it, that doesn't necessarily, it's not cherry picking, in my opinion. And it doesn't also, it doesn't take the heart out of it. It just restructures it. Like the Dalai Lama has been talking about that with Lam Rim too, kind of structuring it in a different way.
Oh, and there already are. I mean, there's different Lam Rims in different order. I mostly go by the kind of Tibetan or like easy path order. But it takes some discipline, because I think you like to fast forward. When I first started teaching meditation, the nun that I was a spiritual program coordinator I worked most closely with, she teased me because she said I was meditating on love too much. She's like, you have to do all the topics. You have to meditate on suffering. And it's really true. Like, you really do need to do all the topics, because you can be very loving. Like, love comes very easy for me. Compassion is a little harder. Mm-hmm. But like, to combine them all together, like, you really see, like, with too much love, it's sort of like denial a little bit, that it's like rose-colored glasses, that you want to accept the suffering and how destructive delusions are, and so on. All these pieces really need to work together. It's very beautiful, very elaborate, and very beneficial, for anyone who's interested.
Well, thanks so much for offering that out there, Scott. I mean, I'm a big supporter of what you do, obviously, because you're on, you're here, we're talking for an hour and a half, and so just I wish the course and just all you do in your teaching in Skeptics Path to Enlightenment, well, yeah, just to wrap up, just really wish to hear, but thanks so much for coming on. It's just like we got to, chat and meander, and yeah, I just love the way you think. So thank you for sharing.
Oh, likewise, Scott. It's really nice talking to you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I hope we can do this again.
Oh, let's definitely. Yeah, I think we had some specific topic for the next one. So later,
let's do it. I'm down.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining us.